Allez,
characters
dis-nous
level
tout,
100
monsieur
to
Aaron
resolve
Trailer.
Earthquake and win the game.
Ouais.
As it turns out, though, winning at the multiplayer of competitive Pokémon, beating another human player, or becoming world champion, well, that's really difficult. It's natural to ask, why is competitive Pokémon hard? And the thing is, answering that question is also really difficult. Because competitive Pokemon is so complex that it's hard to even put into words just how hard it is and how much is going on. There are over 1,000 different Pokemon species and over 900 different
Ouais.
Pokemon moves to choose from,
Oh.
and selecting the right ones for your team
Dis-nous
is
tout.
tough enough, but then you actually have to battle someone with their own team of carefully trained Pokemon. How are you going to knock out all of their Pokemon and reach victory? And the flow of a competitive Pokemon battle feels a lot like a game of chess, classically regarded as one of the hardest strategy games out there, where positioning your pieces is everything. Yet, at the same time, there are some aspects of Pokemon that feel similar to rock, paper, scissors, which is not classically regarded as
Donc
one
ça
of
mélange
the
entre
hardest games of all
les
time.
échecs et
But if you want to win,
pierre feuille
you
ciseaux.
might need to foresee with perfect accuracy what your opponent is thinking before
Et
they
des
make
fois,
their move.
faut être voyant.
How do these
C'est
strategic
quand même,
elements overlap?
faut quand même beaucoup de choses.
And
Faut quand même beaucoup de
where
choses.
does the complexity of competitive Pokemon actually come from? Now, we could talk about how to build a strong team of Pokemon in the current rule set, or about my top tips for battling and ranking up the ladder, and
Ou
those
des
topics are
tips
interesting too.
pour les
But
battles,
neither of
pour
them
les combats.
get at what's going on underneath the surface of competitive Pokemon. The strategy is like this tangled web, and when you answer one question about it, many, many more often follow. I want to untangle it. No tangle it, not literally. I want to break down competitive Pokemon at its core and find its fundamental building blocks that make up what it even is as a strategic game.
Il va nous expliquer ce que c'est
Who's this dude who's
les
about to tell me
Pokémon,
all of this?
la compétition Pokémon.
In my 15 years playing VGC, short for Video Game Championships, the official tournament series for competitive Pokemon, I've placed top 8, 16, and 64th at the Pokemon World Championships, among regional wins and others. But, on the side, I got my PhD in computer science, and studied a lot of cognitive science as well. My research interest these days is in applying all that I know to understanding competitive Pokemon, and I want to use this channel to share what I find along the way.
Le monstre.
All that being said, let's get started talking about the game theory of competitive Pokemon. Competitive Pokemon is made up of two phases. Team building, where you pick the 6 Pokemon that you can use,
C'est le plus dur pour moi, team
and then
building.
battling, where you use those 6
Battling,
Pokemon.
c'est ok,
You pick a team of Pokemon,
mais team
and then
building,
you
c'est
battle
trop
with them.
compliqué.
We're going to start by talking about battling, and then we'll talk about team building. This might seem backwards. After all, you need to have the Pokemon before you can battle with them, but the truth is, you need to know how to win battles to know which Pokemon are going to lead you to victory. Also, battling is really difficult, but team building is really, really difficult, so we will get there, I promise.
C'est ce que j'ai dit. Genre,
In battling, even
en
though
combat,
you
c'est
and your
trop
opponent
difficile,
have a full team
parce
of
que
Pokemon,
tu dois
in
penser à
VGC, you pick 4
tout,
of the 6 to come to the
savoir
battle.
ce que le mec peut
Only
faire,
up to 2 of
savoir
them
ce
can be
qui...
on the
Il y a
field at
toujours, s'il y a
once.
toujours le tel win, si,
Even with the most
etc.
powerful
Les
attack,
boosts
like what
et les
Mewtwo
malus.
uses in this example, totally annihilating
Mais
both
team
of the
building,
Arceus,
c'est
you can't
3000
win
fois
the
plus
game all at
difficile,
once.
je trouve.
At the end of this turn, your opponent will have the opportunity to switch in fresh, healthy Pokemon. This brings us to our first strategic element of battling, long-term planning. It might take a long time before you knock out all of your opponent's Pokemon and win the battle. VGC-style double battles, like the one above, are usually about 8 to 12 turns, but can go on for as long as roughly 40 turns, depending on the timer and how fast the players move. And single battles, like this one, where only one Pokemon is on the field, but you typically use all 6, are longer. Generally, they're around 50 turns as a
50... Oh bah oui,
but they can
VGC c'est
easily
mieux.
last upwards
50
of
tours,
hundreds
mais
of turns.
tu meurs en fait.
Especially if you're playing one of the Grindfest formats such as Gold, Silver, Crystal, which revolve around stalling your opponents out of moves and mostly serve as a modern form of torture for gamers with short attention spans. Battles generally taking a while means that early turns have a big impact on later turns, and you can set up a strategy well in advance to secure a victory. Here's how. Broadly speaking, the Pokemon on a team need to work together. First, the relationship between different types, like the classic fire, water, grass cycle, governs a lot of the strategy behind Pokemon synergy. Practically speaking, how type synergy actually plays out in a battle is that early on, if you can use your water type Gyarados to hit your opponent's fire type Arcanine with a super effective attack and knock it out, later on, When you send out your grass type Venusaur, you've set it up for success. Your opponent now has one less tool to stop Venusaur on its march to victory. Arcanine might even have been their only fire type. As a strategic piece, Venusaur is now much more valuable.
Ouais.
So, you can't just think about what's the best move right now, but you also need to keep in mind how you're setting yourself up for success in the distant future. Because long-term success isn't just about taking knockouts, as there are many ways for your Pokemon to work together to achieve victory. This is Whimsicott, classically known as one of the best supportive Pokemon of all time. Now, it's not very strong, but its ability Prankster, which
Prankster,
increases the priority of
Tailwind,
all of its
Taunt.
non-attacking
Il y a des
moves,
trucs.
lets it contend with even the strongest legendary Pokemon. This is an actual game that I played in an online tournament over the summer of 2025. I started with my Whimsicott and Miraidon out on the field versus my opponent's Fluttermane and Chi-Yu. On turn 1, Whimsicott moves first thanks to its Prankster ability, using the supporting move Tailwind, which doubles the speed stat of your entire team of Pokemon for 4 turns. But then my opponent fires back with the combination Dazzling Gleam and Heat Wave, which are strong enough to knock out both of my Pokemon in one go. As the dust clears on the first turn, the Pokemon count has gone from an even 4-4 at the start to me losing half of my Pokemon on turn 1, and all I got in return was a measly Tailwind. If you just looked at the damage done and the Pokemon count, you would think that I was finished. But Tailwind actually makes all of the difference.
Vu qu'il est,
On the
qu'il est
next
plus rapide
turn,
du coup.
I send out Urshifu Water and Ogerpon Hearthflame, and they are ready for revenge. Thanks to Whimsicott's Tailwind, even though Fluttermane and Chi-Yu are naturally faster, my Pokemon have a total speed advantage and dominate the field. There's nothing that my opponent can do. They scramble and switch out their Fluttermane for a Moongus, which isn't healthy for long, because next up, Ogerpon hits it with a super effective Fire-type Ivy
Ivy
Cudgel,
Cudgel.
dropping it in one shot, rip to a real one, and then Urshifu follows up with its signature Surging Strike,
qui one
also
shot.
knocking the poor Chi-Yu out in one shot.
Attends, mais du coup, il reste combien de
At the end
Tailwind
of the second turn, I've equalized the Pokemon count, but it's
Ah oui,
not
attends,
enough.
c'est que le tour 2, donc là il y a
On
encore
turn
3 tours
3,
de
my
Tailwind.
opponent sends out Fluttermane
Non, c'est
one
4.
more time,
Du coup, il en a
this
encore
time
2.
alongside the legendary Pokemon Zamazenta.
Oh, Zamazenta.
It's still not enough. With another combination, Surging Strikes into Fluttermane and super effective Ivy Cudgel into Zamazenta, I take 2 more knockouts. My opponent runs out of Pokemon.
Monstre,
With just
monstre,
2
monstre, monstre.
Pokemon left,
Ça veut
I
rien
win
dire
the
des fois.
game
Des fois,
in one
tu
of the shortest VGC
tues
battles
vite les adversaires,
possible.
mais
Although Whimsicott didn't do 1 point of damage,
ça te
and
met
it
dans le mal.
fainted in one
Genre, des fois, il
turn,
faut
it was
laisser le Pokémon en
undoubtedly
vie
the MVP. Its Tailwind attack
pour
set me up for
que
a
ta
quick
game
and
pour que tu gagnes la
unstoppable
game.
success. Pokemon battles are not necessarily a straight path from beginning to end. There are a lot of ways to get your opponent down to 0 Pokemon. However, your resources do shrink as time in the battle continues, because once a Pokemon is knocked out, there are very few ways
Oui,
to bring
plus
it
le
back.
temps passe, moins t'as de
So
ressources.
as you move from the early game, where both players can make use of all of their available Pokemon and moves, to the late game, where you might only have 1 or 2 Pokemon remaining, you have to manage your resources extremely well to make sure you're leaving
Donc,
yourself the right
faut
tools
manage.
to win.
Faut manager.
One other
Comment
strategy game that revolves around long-term
Manager.
planning is chess, and I'd say it's how the two are
Faut
most
savoir quand
alike.
utiliser
Similarly to
quoi.
Pokemon, resources decrease over
Si
time as
tu
chess
utilises
pieces
ça
are
maintenant,
captured
est-ce que
and
ça va
come
te
off the board.
mettre mal
So
plus tard?
there's also an early game with
C'est
many
du mind game, les gars.
possibilities
C'est du
and a
mind game.
late
C'est du
game
mind
with
game.
few.
C'est du mind game.
When you watch a chess match, the players are usually not just thinking about what's in front of them, they're thinking deep into the future, sometimes 20 turns, or even over 50 turns ahead.
C'est vrai que
But
les échecs,
even though
ils pensent
foresight and
vraiment,
long-term planning
vraiment
are a
loin.
huge part of both chess and Pokemon, planning for the future plays out in completely separate ways in each game because their mechanics are totally different. One big mechanical difference between the two games is when the players choose their moves or select their actions. In chess, one player makes their move,
Ouais, c'est vrai, c'est
and then it's the other
aux
player's
échecs, c'est
turn,
un après
and
l'autre.
each player
En-
very politely
Sur
waits
Pokémon,
for their
c'est les
opponent's
deux en
turn
même
to
temps.
end before moving again, repeating all the way until the
Donc
end.
t'as plus le
How
temps de
noble,
voir ce
how
que
refined,
l'adversaire peut faire.
how
aux échecs.
elegant. Even if you don't know what your opponent will do, after you make your own move, at the end of your turn, it will always look this way. You can be certain what the board will look like after you make your move. That must be nice. In Pokemon, a game filled to the brim with uncertainty, there are no such luxuries. It's time to move into our next section, simultaneous action selection.
Ouais.
In Pokémon, at the start of the turn,
C'est pour ça que c'est
both
difficile parce que
player
tu dois
1
savoir
and
ce que
player
le mec
2
peut faire,
choose their move at
ce
the
que,
same
ce
time.
que tu dois
Here's
penser
another
à ce que
example
le
battle
mec va
between the
faire,
Ghost and Fighting type
et
Annihilate on
si
the
il fait
bottom
ça,
and the Ghost
comment
and
le
Poison type
contrer avec ce que
Gengar on
t'as?
the top.
Oh là 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 là,
Ghost type
monsieur,
attacks
monsieur,
are super
monsieur.
effective versus
Monsieur,
Ghost type
calmez-vous, c'est
Pokémon,
compliqué,
so what
c'est
we have
compliqué.
here is a Wild West style duel. Whichever Pokemon's attack happens first will be massively favored. You can kind of imagine the trainers shouting, "Go Annihilate, you Shadow Claw!" and "Go Gengar, you Shadow Ball!" in perfect harmony, like at the exact same moment. Once both players have chosen a move, the game then executes those moves in a predetermined sequence, based on factors such as the Pokemon's speed stat. We'll say Annihilate is faster to use its Shadow Claw. Because Shadow Claw is super effective, and Gengar's defenses are actually quite bad, when the attack lands, Gengar is knocked out in one hit. Then, the turn is over, and the next turn starts. Now, we're going to edit the example to make simultaneous decision-making a little bit more of a factor in how the turn plays out. Let's say whoever gets this KO wins, and we're going to take player 1's perspective. This is our decision matrix so far. We're going to give each player one more option to choose from. Our opponent will always use Shadow Ball in this example, so I'll just cover that up for now, but now they have the option to Terrastalize, Terra for short, to the normal type. They could always not. Now, Terrastalizing to normal type gets you a cool little diamond hat, which I've included, but more importantly, it changes Gengar's typing from Ghost/Poison to only the normal type, which is immune to Ghost type attacks. This means when we Shadow Claw, it will deal no damage at all, meaning Gengar has a chance to fire back with Shadow Ball, knocking our Annihilate out in one shot, and we lose. But our second option is to use the move Close Combat, which is fighting type and super effective.
Ouais, mais là c'est compliqué. Là c'est compliqué. Là c'est très compliqué. Très compliqué. En fait, si tu fais le mauvais choix, t'as presque perdu.
The Ghost type is also immune to fighting type, meaning we would again do 0 damage, allowing them to once again Shadow Ball us for the KO, meaning we would lose on the spot. So, at the beginning of the turn, you don't actually know what future state you'll end up in, thus uncertainty when planning ahead. This type of cut-and-dry, win-or-lose board position can and does come up in real games, and they are sometimes referred to as being like rock, paper, scissors, or a mind game, which are terms not thrown around positively. Rock, paper, scissors is the classic example of a simultaneous move game. If it were turn-based like chess, well, that game might not work out very well.
Là, le truc il expliquait, celui qui perd le pierre fait ciseaux entre les deux, si tu Terra, que t'as fait close combat et du coup tu one shot, et si tu fais pas Terra et du coup tu mets le close combat dans le truc, dans le gars, et si tu Terra mais tu as fait griffe ombre, ça c'est mind game mais de ouf, c'est mind game de ouf.
Game states like the Annihilate and Gengar situation do happen. The goal is to avoid being in this spot entirely. For example, in the final turn of the Whimsicott game earlier, thanks to Tailwind, my Pokemon had such a strong advantage that there was literally nothing my opponent could do. I had a guaranteed win condition with no mind game. Conquering simultaneous move choice is partially about planning in the long term well. And at the beginning of the game, trying to navigate to futures where you have a clear-cut advantage, not where you need to make it through a mind game before you can win. And truthfully, I kind of set up this example to come down to a pure mind game, because I put it in the late game where the next KO wins. But what if, instead, it were in the early game, like on turn 1, and the choices made by each player had far-reaching implications? For example, if Gengar Terrastalized to become immune to Annihilape's attack and knocked it out with Shadow Ball, of course, for our opponent, that might be a good thing, in the moment. But players only get to Terrastalize one Pokemon over the course of a battle, and now player 2 can't Terrastalize another Pokemon, a choice that, later on, they might regret. Or, maybe on turn 1 we successfully knock out the Gengar, but on turn 2 our opponent sends out the powerful Clefable, which is Fairy type, meaning it resists Annihilape's fighting type attack, and Clefable is actually bulky enough to not worry about neutral ghost type attacks. It can set up however it wants, and we have to scramble. This is a bad spot despite getting what we wanted on an earlier turn. We might even lose the game because of the opening we gave Clefable right here. You can see that when it's late in the game, making a decision in this scenario that I've concocted can feel really straightforward, And like its ultimate conclusion is that both players will have to opt into a mind game.
Ouais.
But in the early game, these scenarios are not so clear-cut. While they might seem probably good or probably bad, after all, either you take a KO or get a Pokemon KO'd, each of these possibilities is more than meets the eye. Every possible choice has its own far-reaching implications into the future, and each one needs to be considered individually if you want to make the best move. There is, of course, still a part of these more complicated decisions that feels like rock, paper, scissors. You need to figure out what your opponent will do, but it's much more complicated in Pokemon. Furthermore, I've dialed down the difficulty for this example. What if each player could choose from 4 moves? Or what if we had to consider the Pokemon that each player could switch into? What if it weren't this toy example at all, but a real double battle? Then we'd have to consider the 4 moves and switches of both of our opponent's Pokemon, and, of course, each of our own. In that case, our grid showing the outcome of each decision wouldn't look like this at all. It'd look closer to this, and honestly, even this is too few possibilities. And in VGC, you only have 45 seconds to pick your move. Even if you and your opponent are the best Pokemon players on Earth,
Ok, oh.
there's no way you can think through every possible move combination, or even a large fraction of them. So making decisions at the same time actually results in a great deal of complexity, and Pokemon is much, much more than rock, paper, scissors.
Ouais.
If you were to ask the question, how good is any given move in a Pokemon battle, the answer is it depends. Because you and your opponent move at the same time, the strength of your move choice depends on the options your opponent has available, like their moves, and it depends on what they may or may not do, which you can't know when you're making your move because you only see their move after they've chosen it, resulting in our good old friend, uncertainty. The side effect of simultaneous decision making is that understanding your opponent, their thought process, what they think of the
C'est vrai
battle
que
in front of
si
them,
t'as l'habitude de
how
jouer
they like
contre
to make moves,
quelqu'un,
that
tu
becomes
sais à peu
really
près comment il
important.
va jouer,
Let's go
son
back to
style
our
de
problem.
jeu,
The late game version,
qu'il
where we win or
préfère,
lose right
les
here, right
moves
now. We want to take an educated guess what our
qu'il aime
opponent is going to do.
bien, au moment qu'il aime bien.
However, this
Donc,
time, we're not just
c'est pour
playing
ça que
against
dans
a
les
nondescript
BO3 ou les
player 2,
BO5,
but our
la
friend
première game,
Terry.
c'est toujours prise
Terry
d'information.
normal.
Prise
He's
d'information.
even wearing his favorite
Deuxième
t-shirt,
game,
which reads,
c'est celui
I
qui a pris le
love
plus d'informations qui gagne.
terrestrializing my Gengar
Et après,
to the
ils sont à
normal
peu
type.
près égaux,
When
donc
you're
c'est celui
facing
qui
off
gère
against
mieux le
Terry
combat.
wearing his special shirt, are you gonna say, gee, I don't know, he really could go either way, I guess it's rock, paper, scissors? Or are you going to take an educated guess? Now, opponents don't always wear a t-shirt like Terry to tell you what they're about to do. Part of the fun, and the skill, of playing against someone in a Pokemon battle is figuring out, what does my opponent want? Or, how will my opponent react? Are they overly aggressive? Are they cautious or afraid of you? Do they bet it all on guessing exactly how you will react? But note that thinking through how will my opponent react, or, more straightforwardly, what will my opponent do, actually depends on another thing that you have to know, which is what can my opponent do? And in Pokemon, it's not guaranteed that you know the options available to your opponent. Everything that we've discussed so far, where we've compared Pokemon to chess and rock, paper, scissors, has existed in the world of perfect information, where both players know the entire state of the game. Even if you don't know what move your opponent will make, you know all of the moves that they can make. In chess, both players' pieces can only move in so many ways, and in rock, paper, scissors, you would be very surprised if your opponent played something that was not rock, paper, or scissors, like, I don't know, frog. Pokemon is typically not a game of perfect information, which brings us to our next section, imperfect information, where players may know parts of the game state that the other player doesn't. When we talk about imperfect information in Pokemon, usually we're talking about not knowing details about the other person's team of Pokemon before the battle starts.
Ouais. Mais le seul truc qu'on voit pas dans les vrais tournois, c'est les EV.
Are so customizable, with over 1,000 different species, 900 different moves, abilities, held items, Terra types, customizable stats, and so much more. When you see an opponent's Pokemon at the start of battle, you might have very little idea what it will do, even if you know a lot about battling. If you at home were to go on the in-game ladder on Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, you
C'est vrai
wouldn't
que si
be
tu
able
fais
to
des game
see
ladder,
any of the team-specific information before you started the battle, except for the species, the literal 6 Pokemon that they have on their team. Remember how we just talked about how difficult it is to choose a move at the same time as the other player? Well, now what if you don't even know what their options are? That can make it nearly impossible to say for sure how this turn is going to go for you. Now, Pokemon isn't just blind guessing. You can usually make an educated guess. Pokemon typically learn attacking moves of the same type that they are, so if you see an Arcanine, which is fire type, you can usually assume it will use fire type moves.
Ah, même pas
And as
tous,
we
pas
spoke
tous.
about earlier, some Pokemon have uniquely strong options, like Whimsicott and its prankster Tailwind. So, when you see a Pokemon on your opponent's team, you can often assume, or make an educated guess, what it might do before you ever see it move.
Okay.
But be careful. Your assumptions can get you in trouble, and tricky opponents can play on them and surprise you in order to gain an advantage during battle. Going back to our Gyarados versus Arcanine example, if you're the Gyarados player, you might say, aha, well, Arcanine is fire type, so it will use fire type
Mais il a
moves,
tonnerre, non?
and that means my water type
Non, il a pas
Gyarados
tonnerre.
will
Si, il a
survive
tonnerre.
whatever it can do. But Pokemon can often learn useful moves that you might not expect. Arcanine can actually learn Wild Charge, which is an electric type attack, which will absolutely fry your Gyarados with super effective damage. And if you see an opposing Whimsicott, you might say, well, it'll probably use Tailwind, so I'll counter that with my own Tailwind, maybe using some Pokemon like Zapdos to set that up. What you might expect to happen is that both Pokemon will use Tailwind, meaning neither player has a speed advantage. This time, however, what actually happens is your Zapdos uses Tailwind, but then you see Whimsicott use Trick Room. This attack reverses the speed rule for 5 turns, meaning that your Tailwind actually becomes a speed disadvantage. You will now have a tough time winning this battle. This is really tricky on your opponent's part, because even with the Prankster ability, Trick Room has such a bad move priority that it usually goes last in a turn, meaning that they were really just banking on surprising you. So, you've got to be on your toes. Clever opponents will use any information that you don't know as a tool against you. The imperfect information in Pokemon might remind you of many other games, such as Guess Who, where you have to guess a person from a lineup based on the other player's descriptions, or playing card games, one notable example being poker. Now, in these games, the imperfect information is kind of the entire substance of the strategy. Much like turn-based rock, paper, scissors, Guess Who would not be very fun if it was Know Who, and if other players could see your cards in poker, you might not win very much money. But even though over the course of a Pokemon battle, the amount of unknown information decreases as each player learns more about the other team, competitive Pokemon still works as a game when all players know everything. Your team and your team-building choices can't change until the end of a battle, or until the end of most tournaments. This means that you're stuck with your choices until the game is over, and that includes any fast ones you're trying to pull on your opponent. And as we discussed in the long-term planning section, battles can last a long time. Your choices and potential surprises or bluffs need to either get you a huge advantage on the spot or be useful in the long run.
Désolé, je vous ai muté.
Imagine that you ran a devilishly evil Trick Room Whimsicott and paired it with some super fast Pokemon, all trained to be as slow as possible to really fool your opponent. You might catch them off guard, but you'd better win quickly. Trick Room only lasts for 5 turns, so as soon as it ends, these Pokemon are super slow sitting ducks. Literally, by your design. Or, going back to the Zapdos example, maybe Whimsicott doesn't fool Zapdos into setting Tailwind. What if before Whimsicott can act, Zapdos just uses a super effective flying type attack and knocks out Whimsicott? Your bluff got called. So, you have to tread lightly and make sure you really are comfortable with everything that your team does. Imperfect information dials up the amount of uncertainty, which, as we've established, makes Pokemon more challenging for both you and your opponent. Now, on the official ladder, there's a lot of information that you can't see, but it's important for me to mention that if you were to go to an official tournament, like a regional or the World Championships, you actually get to see a lot more. Everything except for the stats of your opponent's Pokemon is given to you at the start of the battle, which reduces variance by a lot, though unknown information can still affect how the game unfolds. There's actually one more source of imperfect information in VGC battles that rarely gets discussed in the same breath: which Pokemon are benched. When players choose 4 Pokemon to bring to the battle, they leave 2 behind. They choose another 2 to lead, sending them out immediately. Even though you know your opponent's whole team, you don't know which of their remaining Pokemon are lurking for you in the back. You have to be very careful with your moves until your opponent reveals their last Pokemon. One switch you didn't expect or forgot about can totally foil all of your plans. You could just play perfect information Pokemon if you really wanted to. You and your opponent sit down, tell each other everything about your team and which Pokemon you have in the back, whisper sweet nothings in dulcet tones, then hold hands and skip off into the sunset, happily knowing you have reduced the amount of uncertainty. Nobody really does this, in part because that's just not the game we play, but also, it doesn't take out all of the uncertainty. First, because you and your opponent are still moving at the same time, and also because of our fourth and final strategic element of battling, probability management, where you have to control the many probabilities that are baked into the game's mechanics. There are 4 main sources of randomness in Pokemon to manage.
4 sources random.
First up is move accuracy.
Ok, ouais, des fois tu peux couper tes moves, ça dépend s'ils ont combien d'accuracy.
Are 100% accurate, but not all
Combien
of
de
them.
précision.
For example, the Fire-type move Will-O-Wisp applies the burn status to a Pokemon, and what that means is the burned Pokemon takes a bit of damage at the end of the turn, but more importantly, the damage done by its physical attacks is reduced in 1/2, which can really hinder a Pokemon. Will-O-Wisp's accuracy is only 85%. So 85% of the time, you'll successfully burn the other Pokemon, but the other 15% of the time, what will happen is your attack misses, which can have disastrous consequences. The second source of randomness
Ça c'est le pire truc, genre si tu loupes une attaque et ça te fait perdre le tour. Comment c'est ignoble,
which has 100% accuracy and is fairly high power, dealing pretty good damage as you'll see here. But on top of that, there's a 10% chance for its secondary effect, where it will also burn the opposing Pokemon, which is a huge freebie on top. Our next source of randomness is critical hits. Every attack has a 4.17% chance to crit, or 1 out of 24, but some moves have higher odds. Critical hits deal 1.5 times as much damage, and if that's not enough, they also ignore your Pokemon's attacking stat drops and their Pokemon's defensive stat raises. As you can imagine, landing a rare critical hit is quite powerful. Last up is damage rolls. I've picked the roller coaster icon here because damage rolls increase uncertainty, variance, and complexity in Pokemon more than any other probability mechanic. The damage done by one attack is calculated by the damage formula. You don't have to memorize this, pretty much no one does, but here's part of it. At the end, it's multiplied one final time by the damage rolled, a random integer between 85 and 100, which is then divided by 100. As a result, there are up to 16 possible damage values that a move can deal on any given turn. This means that sometimes you're playing a battle, let's say Snorlax and Whimsicott this time, and your attack does what looks like just over half of your opponent's health. You're happy about this, because that means the next one will knock out Whimsicott, which would be a big deal. But on the next turn, because of damage rolls, your next attack might actually do just under half of Whimsicott's HP. Your second attack might have low rolled, getting one of the lower 16 possible damage rolls. This might also raise your blood pressure through the roof. Move accuracy, secondary effects, critical hits, and damage rolls. Only the Avatar, master of all 4 elements of variance, can conquer competitive Pokemon. Probability management playing such a huge role in Pokemon battles means that being strategic is all about taking risks appropriately and trying to maximize your odds at any given
Donc
point.
maximiser nos chances de random. C'est bizarre, mais oui, c'est ça.
Or is that risk necessary?
Maximiser
And
l'aléatoire.
combines
Maximiser
each of the 3
l'aléatoire.
other strategy components we've discussed so far. First up, long-term planning. Adding randomness to decisions makes it even harder to see into the future. If you're about to click Will-O-Wisp on an opponent's Pokemon, you at bare minimum have to think through 2 futures. The world where it hits and the world where it misses, and you suffer the consequences. You also have to consider how that hit or miss will affect you in the future and whether that's a risk you can take. Next up, simultaneous action selection. To continue the Will-O-Wisp example, now on top of whether your move might hit or miss, what if your opponent might switch in a Pokemon that actually benefits from being burned, like Machamp with the Guts ability, which both raises its attack stat when statused and ignores the damage drop that comes from the burn? If they don't switch out Gyarados, getting the burn is good and missing is bad, but if they do switch out Gyarados, that Machamp powers up, which is really bad for you. But you could also miss the Machamp when it switches in, which would be good for you, I suppose. Now you have to consider multiple possible moves and your opponent's decision-making profile when taking risk into account. Lastly, imperfect information. Now imagine trying to land that Will-O-Wisp, but you're concerned that Gyarados' held item could be the Lumberry, which cures any status once. But you don't know Gyarados is holding one for sure, so it's a big maybe whether that will happen. If they are holding the Lumberry, as always, nothing happens if you miss, but now, even if you hit Will-O-Wisp, the burn is cured, and Arcanine will faint. You are hosed no matter what. Earlier, I said that given a turn of a competitive battle, along with all of your possible moves, and your opponent's possible moves, trying to figure out all of the outcomes, all of the possible next turns, and which ones are good or bad for you, would look like this grid, with an iceberg representing the murky long-term future in each square. And we might not know how far out this grid extends. We don't know what moves our opponent can even use because of imperfect information. Let's leave that aside for now because this visualization doesn't take into account the variance. Even just one pair of choices between us and our opponent could result in countless possible next turns because of all of the percentage chances like crits, misses, and damage rolls. So, representing the outcomes as a grid isn't necessarily correct. It would be more accurate to represent the possible next turns as a skyscraper, a monument to uncertainty and complexity, and each room in the skyscraper is its own deep dark mystery to be uncovered. All of the dimensions that make Pokemon battles challenging, long-term planning, simultaneous actions, imperfect information, and probability management are interconnected and interact with each other to give the game its strategic depth.
Ouais, mais il y a trop de choses en fait.
Pokemon
C'est
sits
ça qui est chiant.
right in the middle here.
Bah, c'est pas chiant, parce que du coup, ça
Put any
met
number of competitive games on here to compare them
de
to
la
Pokemon.
stratégie, ça met plus
Chess sits right in long-term planning. Rock,
de
paper,
réflexion.
scissors is
Et du
really
coup,
only a
ceux
simultaneous
qui aiment bien, genre
decision-making
vraiment,
game.
ils sont addicts.
Poker actually
Ils sont
involves
addicts.
all of long-term planning, imperfect information,
Et
and
du coup,
probability
c'est
management.
vraiment stylé.
Any pure game of chance falls under probability management. For completeness, some other games that we haven't talked about yet are chess, with Fog of War, where you can't see your opponent's pieces at a distance, as well as the popular deck-building game Magic the Gathering, which falls in the same zone as poker. We could go on and on. Many of these games are quite complex and can take a lifetime to master. But only competitive Pokemon battling combines all of these elements. None of these games, or any other as far as I know, do all four quite the same way. In my opinion, Pokemon is fun because you have to balance strategy across all of these areas. You can't
En fait,
neglect
faut que
one.
tu prennes de tout,
Say, as a thought experiment,
et
you want to
hop,
make the
tu les
strategy
mixes,
of competitive Pokemon
et
more
boum,
manageable.
tu dois jouer avec
It's
ça.
easy to imagine going north and taking out our sources of randomness from Pokemon. No more heartbreaking misses. No more awful critical hits, which completely removes variance at the expense of the complexity that makes Pokemon interesting. It would also reduce some of the uncertainty. If you wanted to really reduce uncertainty, you could also take out the imperfect information, and to remove uncertainty once and for all, you could take out the last source of it, simultaneous actions, creating a classic turn-based game with no uncertainty at all, making Pokemon battles as chess-like as possible. But even then, even after taking out all of that strategy and complexity and uncertainty, the game that you would be left with still wouldn't be chess. Because, as you probably know, half of the fun of Pokemon is building a team.
Ouais, c'est
And
ça,
you've
ça
been
c'est
waiting
trop
long
dur,
enough to
c'est
hear
trop
about
dur
that.
les gars, c'est trop dur.
In most formats of Pokemon battles, you have complete control over your team of 6 Pokemon and all of their attributes that we mentioned before. You can tweak all of them as much as you want. Your opponent also has complete control over their Pokemon. Many of the other strategic games that we've discussed so far do not have this much customization if they have any at all. Imagine if you were playing chess and you could choose what pieces to put on the board, like 15 knights and 1 Charizard if you wanted. Imagine poker, where you and a friend choose your own cards to put into one big deck, like a collaborative game of Balatro. And what makes Pokemon team building in particular very challenging is that the possible combinations of all of the different knobs that you can turn, all of the possible ways you can customize a team, multiplied together to equal all possible teams, that number is big. It's very, very big. In 2019, Smogon Forums user Delibird Hart calculated this number as 6.08701 times 10 to the 218 possible teams.
C'est un peu beaucoup, c'est un peu beaucoup, je pense que c'est un peu beaucoup.
That was for the Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon era, and there are only more
Je sais pas,
Pokemon
mais ça a l'air un peu beaucoup.
But that number is more than there are stars in the sky, more than the number of atoms in the universe.
Ah.
And even the smallest change to a team really does matter. Real-life tournaments with prizes worth thousands of dollars have been won or lost by training a Pokemon to be 1 speed point faster than the other players. Remember that if a Pokemon is knocked out before it can move, the attack doesn't go through at all, just like the Gengar and Annihilape example, where the faster Pokemon could win on the spot. So, being even just a hair faster than your opponent can cause the whole skyscraper of potential outcomes of this turn to be flipped on its head. And, of course, moving before your opponent means any secondary effects may be more impactful. The strongest status is Freeze, which happens rarely, but renders a Pokemon completely unable to attack for a number of future turns. Stopping an opponent's Pokemon cold with a stray freeze from a move like Blizzard has turned many a game around. We focused on battling.
Après freeze, tu l'as pas souvent, mais quand tu l'as, comment t'es content. Tu fais une attaque glace, t'es là. Et dès que t'as le freeze, t'es hyper bien.
Team building and then battling is a lot murkier. Sure, you can say that the goal of team building is to give yourself the best tools to win the battle.
Ouais.
But what does that even mean?
Avoir les meilleurs outils pour gagner.
Now, there are definitely some good rules of thumb when you're team building. Some Pokemon, like Mewtwo, have high base stats, meaning that they're super powerful. And some Pokemon, like Bidoof, have much lower base stats, meaning that unless you have a really, really good reason, you probably would rather have Mewtwo than Bidoof on your team. And, as we talked about before, you probably want the Pokemon on your team to work together well and cover each other's weaknesses, like how Gyarados helped defend Venusaur from Arcanine. But also, whether or not a Pokemon is quote-unquote good is relative, and it's hard to define that in advance. Mewtwo might have higher base stats than Bidoof, but if you put Mewtwo in a field of other legendary Pokemon that also have high stats, how do you know that Mewtwo is a good Pokemon to choose compared to anything else you could have? And although Gyarados can defend Venusaur from Fire-type attacks, maybe at your tournament you don't play against any Fire-types at all, but you do play against the Electric and Flying-type Zapdos, which can deal super effective damage to both Gyarados and Venusaur, meaning that their synergy
du coup, il t'en faut un troisième.
as good for you as you
il t'en faut un roche ou un truc comme ça.
As a result, one part of team building strategy that feels important is the idea of a metagame. If you can successfully predict the teams that you'll play against, you can then try to optimize to make your team as strong as possible versus what you expect, maximizing your chance to win. If you know that you're about to play against 5 opponents with teams that make use of the sun weather, boosting the damage of fire-type attacks and weakening the damage of water-type attacks, thus synergizing well with their fire types, it might be good for you to choose a team that makes use of the inverse weather, rain, where we flip these so that water-type attacks are strong and fire-type attacks are weak, and you could use water-type Pokemon that will benefit from the boost. However, note that metagames feel like kind of a social construct in some ways, and that feels slightly different from the other strategic elements that we've discussed so far. If I were to sit a competitive player down, maybe someone who's played at the World Championships, and have them play against 10 mystery opponents that they'd never heard of before, they would be able to execute all of the strategic elements of battling pretty well. On the other hand, if I were to take that same expert player and give them a mystery team-building problem, plop them in a brand new format, perhaps called Regulation -Q, and tell them to build a team to play against 10 mystery opponents with 10 totally unknown teams, there's no metagame to analyze. Where would they even start? What signals would they even use to succeed? Actually, in my next video, I'm going to try tackling this problem in a fairly unconventional way, and it doesn't go very well, so please stay tuned and subscribe if you want to see that. But I can guarantee you that any successful team builder in that situation would ask for 2 things. First, a ladder to test their ideas on, and second, information about what other people are doing, which is again metagame or social information. Now, practice games are really important. For example, if I were to go on the ladder with my Gyarados and Venusaur team, and I played against a Zapdos and I got totally hosed, I would now know Okay,
Il faut quelque
I
chose
gotta
pour
figure
protéger
out
les deux.
some way to beat Zapdos. My current team might not be good enough. So, I'd go back and make some adjustments to my team. Maybe another Pokemon would be better. Although you need a team before you can battle, it's a two-way street. Team building is dependent on feedback from the battling stage. The result is that the team building process is really iterative. It's a problem with two parts. You build a team of Pokemon, you hit the ladder, you get some feedback, you tweak your team, repeat this process forever or until your tournament. But the circular nature of this process makes it hard to know what's to blame for success or for failure. If you build a team and win 10 games with it, who's to say how much of that is you being a good battler and how much of that is the team being a good call? What if you play all of your practice games against someone whose decision making you know really well, like Terry Normal, and then at the tournament you play against people who make decisions in completely different ways? Or what if you get lucky in practice? Let's say that your team is 6 Ice-type Pokemon with Blizzard, throwing any sense out the door, and then during practice you freeze every opponent to win all of your games. Yippee! But you might not be lucky enough to have that happen again during the tournament, where the weaknesses of your team, like any fire or rock type, are exposed for all to see. Now, the two-step game, where you customize and then you play, which then gives you valuable feedback, is not necessarily unique to competitive Pokemon battling. Many games let you choose what resources you have available to you, most notably deck-building collectible card games like Magic the Gathering or Pokemon's own trading card game, in which there are many cards available, possibly thousands, and you have to figure out which ones are going to work well together in your deck. As a super rough estimate, if there are 10,000 available cards, and you can have 60 in your deck, that's 10,000 to the 60 possible options for a deck as an upper bound, or just about 10 to the 240th, which is a similarly large number to the number of possible Pokemon teams. Just like how the amount of complexity makes battling fun, I think the complexity of team building, or in any similar deck building game, is a huge part of what can make it
C'est vrai
enjoyable
que
as well.
genre,
If you are someone
imagine
who really likes team building, and I told you,
le team
hey,
building, ce qui est
in
fun, c'est que
regulation
tu
negative
peux
Q, you can only
surprendre les
choose
gens
from these 5
avec
Pikachu,
un
and
Pokémon
don't worry,
qu'ils n'avaient
I
pas
already
pensé,
customized them and gave them
mais qui
moves
marche
and items and
seulement
stats.
dans
You
ta
might not like
façon
that very
et
much.
ta team. Et
Part
c'est
of the
ça
fun of a brand
qui
new
est
rule
vraiment
set of
fun,
allowed
c'est
Pokemon,
essayer de trouver le
one
Pokémon
with more than 5
parfait
Pikachu, maybe even a new
pour ta
generation
team
of Pokemon
à
with
ce
ones that
moment-là,
nobody's
parce
ever
que
used before,
le méta
is going
est
in and
Pokémon
saying,
fort
nobody knows what's going on in
et
this
que
format,
personne n'y avait pensé à ce
I'm going to be
Pokémon.
the one
Ça,
to
c'est fun.
figure it out.
Ça, c'est fun.
And if you
Comme
find
Pachirisu
some
qui
new
avait gagné le World,
strategy that nobody
c'était
else
juste
has
parce
ever
que
expected,
c'était le meilleur
whether or
Pokémon
not it actually
pour
wins
sa team
battles, that feels
au
cool
moment-là
and unique.
contre les Pokémon.
The customization
Maintenant
of
tu le
team
prends,
building
il est pas
feels
ouf
like a
Pachirisu.
personal choice or like an art, and it's one of the best parts of playing competitive Pokemon. For those with stars in their eyes, though, the people who dream of being the best and who want to take on the world's toughest trainers that all have the same dreams. If that's you, you can't just sit around eating crayons. You've got to master both the art of team building and the strategy of battling and perfect the loop of how the two fit together. That's a tall order for just about anyone. So, yeah, team building is very, very complex. Going back to our strategic components of battling, all of these pieces are actually quite well studied by people whose day job is game theory, like economists or computer scientists. It's plausible, though I don't know for sure, that given a Pokemon battle, there is a quote-unquote best way to play it, that these people could use what we know about these components to find. But for team building, I'm not sure we really have the tools yet to say exactly what it's made of. I think it will require novel research, not just Professor Oak in the Pokemon world, like actual real science and theory, to similarly define what the strategic pieces of team building are, let alone how to use those pieces to be a good team builder. I'm going to leave you with one last story.
Même si
In
genre tu
2013,
demandes
my
à
friend
un IA
Harrison went to a professor
de
of computer
bien
science
réfléchir à
at his
Pokémon et tout ça,
school and
ça se
told the
trouve, il ne
professor
pensera
all
pas à un
about team
Pokémon
building a Pokemon and
qui
laid out
est
just
bien
how many
à ce
possibilities
moment-là
there are.
précis
And he
de
asked
ça.
the
Ça se trouve,
professor
il pensera pas.
what he could do to solve the
Genre
problem.
vraiment, c'est
The
compliqué.
professor laughed at him and said, if you solved that, I would give you a PhD on the spot. Well, here we are all these years later, and I don't know how much closer we are now than we were then. So, that's the game theory behind competitive Pokemon. It's unique because of its two-stage team building and battling loop, as well as the huge number of possible teams and the combination of strategic elements that battling is composed of. When we say that Pokemon is like chess or like rock, paper, scissors, this is what we mean. Well, there's parts of the strategy that are kind of similar, but because of how much goes into battling, not to mention team building, Pokemon is its totally own thing that is very, very hard to put into words, let alone win at. Unraveling the challenges behind both team building and battling is the fun that I have playing Pokemon. It took me years just to be able to put all of this into words that I was happy with. I'm still learning too, and who knows how much else is out there. I hope that after watching this video, you learned a little bit, and if somebody asks you why competitive Pokemon is hard, you feel like you can say just a little more than you could before. And if you play competitive Pokemon yourself, know that what you do is a very difficult thing indeed.
Ok, je vois. Et bah, oh, il y a le voile, puis il y a William Spacey. Ouais, il y a Zeng. Il y a du monde, hein. Il y a Yuki. Pokémon. Et bah, franchement, la vidéo elle est incroyable.
Competitive Pokemon is
incroyable, franchement, la vidéo incroyable. Allez voir, bon, pour l'instant, il a pas de vidéo, mais il est incroyable ce monsieur. Allez vous abonner, il faut aller s'abonner à ce monsieur.